Hi everyone, Dr. Samantha Cottrera here for the Imagining a New We video blog, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. This is a Source Saturday video series within a series. Today I am talking with people related to comic books. The idea of Source Saturday was to introduce teachers and other educators to primary and secondary sources that can challenge the ways we normally teach particular time periods. And what I'm doing with this series of videos is I am talking with people related to comic books about how we can bring things like imagination, magic realism, Afrofuturism to our study of history. I've talked to people that are in the process of creating graphic novels, people that have published things as independent artists and writers, people who are Eisner Award nominated graphic novelists. I've talked with professors, I've talked to people interested in digital humanities, I've talked to so many people, and this series is so wonderful. Watch them one by one, or listen to them one-on-one, or watch them independently, but together they really demonstrate the richness of teaching and learning history when we bring in space for art and imagination and interpretation. So enjoy these conversations. So in this video, I'm talking with Julian Chambliss. I don't know if you remember, if you've been watching my videos, that Julian and I actually connected in the summer, and we had a pandemic pedagogy talk. We talked about Juneteenth, we talked about Afrofuturisms, we also talked about digital humanities and comics, and he is far more of a scholar in both of those areas than I am, but it was just amazing to be able to have some of these conversations together. And when I was putting this little series together for comics, it was just wonderful to be like, yes, I can tap Julian again and we can have another conversation, because he brings so much to this. We're going to be talking about two different comics that he created, well, co-created, and about how comics like this can help us think through this moment, think through digital humanities, think through things like climate change, which is really interesting. He is he is a professor in English at MSU, but he also does all of this really cool stuff, and I'm going to read it because he does so much cool stuff I can't remember it. He is a core faculty member in the MSU College of Arts and Letters Consortium for Critical Diversity in Digital Age Research, or CEDAR, which is something I would remember. He's also the Berryman Curator of History at MSU Museum at Michigan State University. So he comes with this like literary history background with like comics and digital humanities and Afrofuturisms. Anyway, I'm just really looking forward to connecting with him again, because it was so wonderful to connect the first time. And this particular Source Saturday, I know he's going to be able to bring so much richness to the conversation. So let's go over to Zoom. Julian, it is so nice to see you again. I know it is way busier. I mean, I didn't think it could be any busier for when we spoke in June, but it is busier now. Thank you so much for making time to talk to me today about comic books and using comic books as a source to to teach and learn from. It's so great to see you again.
Oh, thanks a lot for asking me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, like when we had that conversation in June, we were talking about Juneteenth, we were talking about the protests, and then at the end you were talking about Afrofuturism and comic books, and like we didn't get a chance to kind of explore that more. So it's nice to like do this part B.
Yeah, I mean, it's always great to talk about comics, and of course I do a lot with comics in terms of the classroom and research as well. So yeah, I'm always down to talk about comics.
Before we begin, do you want to introduce yourself again?
Oh, sure. My name is Julian Chambliss. I'm professor of English at Michigan State University. I'm also the Berryman Curator of History at the MSU Museum. I'm also a co-director of the Digital Humanities Literary Cognition Lab here in the Department of English, and a core faculty in the Consortium for Critical Diversity and the Digital Age Research, or CEDAR, here at MSU.
Yeah, so like a real chill schedule most of the time.
Yeah. I do nothing.
Nothing.
Any day. Nothing. Yeah, nothing.
But we get to talk about comic books in the Batcave.
It's true. Yes.
So that's great. So we are talking about comic books. You sent me a couple links.
Sure.
The first thing I just want to talk about is like, what are the sources that we are talking about? So which source do you want to talk about first?
Sure. Let's talk about Future Bear first.
Future Bear, yeah. Okay.
So, Future Bear is an example of what I like to think of as like a critical making project. This is a collaboration between myself and Rachel Simmons at Rollins College in Winter Park, Florida. Rachel is in the art department, and for many years I worked in the history department there. And so this is a project that's probably close to 10 years old. The first issue of Future Bear, and Future Bear should be thought of as like a wall-mounted hybrid graphic narrative, right? So it has elements of both a comic book in its form and structure, but it's meant to be seen in a gallery setting. And this is based on a kind of green art work that Rachel does. And so because of her emphasis on green art, she created an icon that was a bear who had adapted to climate change. So a bear with a jetpack. So if you're looking for her on Instagram, look for a bear with a jetpack. That's Rachel Simmons. But the story of Future Bear was something that she hadn't really thought about. And we both did some TEDx talks together, and we were talking about what we were both talking about. I was talking about comic books, and she was talking about green art. And I saw this image of the bear, and I was like, what's the story with the bear? It's like, there's no story. So if you want to make a story, that's cool. And I was like, sure. And I thought she was joking, but it turned out she was like serious and like, could you make a story? Like our mutual friend was like, Rachel's waiting on your story. Like, oh, okay.
No pressure.
And so I wrote the story. I wrote what I thought was a fairly standard, straight ahead sci-fi story about a bear who travels back in time to save us from the effects of climate change. And that became issue 1. And actually, issue 1 sort of spawned a series of like presentations and gallery shows. And we had an activity book called the Mission Book that's for kids to help them sort of like learn about climate change. And in many ways, we're using some of the sort of basic tenets of comic book storytelling, or with what I understand to be basic comic book storytelling, to tell a story about climate change and climate awareness, and really sort of referencing historically some of the classic debates about conservation and environment that you find in history books. So it's a narrative that was designed to be somewhat expansive, and we're actually working on issue 2, which is another sort of wall-based installation, and we have a bunch of material that's the sort of world of Future Bear, where we talk more about that future world and talk a little bit about some of the consequences of climate as a geopolitical context.
That's so cool. Like there's a couple different layers of that. Like one that, you know, a kind of traditional way of like coming up with a comic book, you can still innovate on that to tell a different type of story, but also how that collaboration happens, like between art and writing. And it's cool that you're thinking about issue 2. Are you coming at it differently than you did issue 1?
I mean, I am approaching it with, I've done a couple of different drafts of the script, and this issue 2 was at some level to me about world building, and in particular, I was concerned with thinking about the consequences of, tensions that come from climate change, right? So there's a lot of politics in it. There's a lot of, because I was really influenced by some of the research I'd seen on social unrest that grows from climate change. And so the loss of habitat for people and the loss of habitat for animals are similar issues. I mean, when animals lose habitat because of climate change, they're forced into new patterns of movement, forced into new patterns of engagement with their environment. And the same is true of people we just don't necessarily look at it that way. But like the
Mm-hmm.
massive amount of movement of refugees that will come from a loss of so much coastal land, and what that will mean in terms of like movements of people, you know, thousands and thousands of people, in terms of resources and some of the struggles around space, and some of the innovative things that people will do. Will some of those people move to more ad hoc floating platforms, which is one of the things that I thought was like really a possibility? Or will there be more conflicts around borders in the global south as you have these large numbers of displaced people taxing resources and taxing the infrastructure of developing countries? And so there were just a number of questions that I thought were like, well, these are sort of like classic, these are questions that people are projecting. There was a pandemic in my story. Now,
Oh, really?
yeah, there was
weird.
There was a pandemic in the story because, of course, climate change. People talk about how, like, well, diseases, and I was like, oh, okay. So there's all manner of things, but there's a couple of things in the story that happened, and Rachel's like, you know, there's a list of things in the story. I'm like, there are two of those things that happened since you wrote the first draft. I'm not altogether okay with that, right?
Are you predicting? Are you creating this future that we're creating?
Yeah. Could this be a happier story?
Yeah.
Like, that's not...
Can we win? Can we stop climate change in this version of the story?
This story, like, yeah, I need to like really go back to that narrative, and like, it was a very strong set of like, when I thought, like, well, you know, if all these predictions are right, this will happen. I'm like, now I'm like,
sorry.
I really don't have a good feeling about this. But really, the ultimate question is, can it achieve some of the outcomes that Rachel and I are thinking about, right? And in particular, educating younger people about climate awareness, right? Not even getting into like this bigger debate that invariably comes up around, like, you know, is climate change real? Whatever. There's a definite sort of like question here about like, are you aware of your impact on climate? And to personalize that for a generation of people who are going to have to make real decisions in terms of young people about their footprint in the world, right? And so having a kind of story where, you know, it's gone badly, and they're coming from a future where like they desperately want to change that, and they're, you know, using time and travel to do it. It's some level fantastic, but if we can sort of, at least in an allegorical way, talk about, well, these are the consequences if you stay on this path, that could be really interesting.
And, I mean, I just read a chapter. I'm editing a collection on precariousness and history teaching, and I just edited a chapter related to climate change and history teaching, and about like we can be narrating humans' actions related to the environment in much more specific ways than we are, and like, what is it that detached us from really thinking of humans and effect on environment in how we teach history. And what I love about this particular source is that, yes, you're creating a world, but it's a world that has like familiar and unfamiliar elements. So you can like learn from it, but you can also understand yourself through it because you can see that familiarity. What do you read from a source like this as a scholar in comic books? What do you read from a source like this in terms of the combinations of image to text that pushes a conversation in a different direction than if it was just art alone or just words alone?
Well, you know, it's always that interaction between the sort of context being provided by the text and the sort of visual pathway, the potentialities represented by the visuals. And so one of the things that we talked about a lot when I was, you know, sort of putting together the script, is that there were certain sort of key concepts that were very important for Rachel, that they be referenced. And sometimes I reference those things directly in text, but sometimes I reference them in symbolic ways, right? So, yeah, for instance, you know, in issue 2, she really wanted to get at like the impact of, oh God, what do they call it? The injection fuel thing. Oh my God, it's a long day.
The injection fuel thing?
Yeah. Oh my God, it's the reason that the United States is producing so much oil and natural gas.
Like
you're
fracking?
Fracking. Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Fracking.
Wait, do you know fracking? Do you know that fracking is also the name of something that soldiers did during the Vietnam War to slightly injure themselves so they can go home?
I did not know that.
Yeah, like they would
know that. Yeah.
They would like throw bombs in certain places that would have residual materials that hopefully would hurt them, but not fatally, so they could get home. So for a really long time, when people talked about fracking, I was like, well, this is a interesting element we're talking about right now.
I've never heard that. That's amazing. But yeah, wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, so
in issue 2, like, you know, I had to integrate something about fracking, and I did that actually not by actually talking about fracking, but actually like using the acronym, like making fracking into an acronym for a key sort of like story element. And then in the first issue, one of the things I wanted to get at was this sort of idea about wise use versus conservation, which was like a real debate in the early 20th century around, you know. And so it really, to me, I really interpreted that debate, which, you know, I've taught in class, as a kind of question around a belief versus a science that you can prove, right? So at some level, the wise use argument was like, you know, God has given us this world to use wisely, right? Like, you know, we're supposed to. But the conservation argument is like, you know, you can't just clear cut. And that was a burgeoning, emerging science of like, well, you know, by preserving, you preserve it in perpetuity for the next generation. Like the conservation movement was rooted in a series of really emerging social psychology and social science transformations happening in the United States, I think. And so, you know, that idea of belief versus, you know, a kind of spiritual thing, like that plays out in the scientist, because on the one hand, in the second issue, you sort of find out what happens to them after they send the future bear to the future, to the past, right? They send the bear back to the past. And there really becomes a way to sort of like track this idea of like, well, there's a belief that people may have, and then there's this question of like the science that people are experiencing. So it's ideas like that where, you know, the text itself can be both physically and intertextually in a way, sort of dealing with bigger issues is always, I think, really interesting. If we get to time, you know, always the question of time. So like we have to like get back together and go like, how are we going to make issue 2?
How are we going to make issues at issue 3?
right, yeah. Yeah, well, we have more than one issue in theory, because I broke it up in a certain way. And yeah, I'm hoping that we'll once the COVID thing, we were actually technically supposed to do something this year. Like this is in our original, if I look back at my original calendar for this year, we were supposed to do a thing for Future Bear, and then like reality hit and a pandemic, and so no.
But you know, I mean, I think that actually taps into something kind of interesting. In that, like, creative work takes a different type of time than like normal time, and that it is very easy to put that to the side, but that's often where we get certain learnings, and to be able to like express our own understanding of things totally different than we would have normally. So like when we're going to get to issue 3 is also a matter of like when are we going to get a chance to be able to like think through things like this, and not in these like type of reactive ways, because this sad polar bear asking, where am I? That teaches a different story than watching it on the news, right? And like,
Right.
when can we get back to that type of processing knowledge?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to think about how the ideas of protecting the future and some of the questions around resources and the consequences of instability around resources, which are so important to when I was originally writing the script for issue 2. Well, now, every one of those questions, like, well, I thought, there were elements where I'm like, this was really bad. But now I'm like, I really need to go back and rethink the level of bad, right? I really need to, because I was like, well, X number of people dying from a plague was pretty bad, but like, maybe I need to revisit those numbers. I really need to revisit those numbers because like that plague was bad, but was it bad enough, right? Like,
Right. I really hope you shoot higher in the badness that we could.
Yeah, I mean, I was really like, there were a couple of things where I thought like, well, yeah, this is super fantastic. But now I'm looking at it going, is it fantastic?
I don't know. I mean, really, like, what happens next? Right? Let's switch over to the Gus Henderson one to talk also like about, in terms of like this combination of text and images, like what can we learn? Like, here's another example of that. What can we learn from a more kind of familiar comic book setup for history in like, what can we learn from this type of medium for learning history?
Yeah, this is really something that I worked on with artist Salim Nuruddin. I'm butchering his name, but
I won't tell. No one will tell.
No, I will. I'm butchering his name.
Okay.
But the goal here was, because again, it's a local history story. We have an African American who contributed a lot in terms of like a local history context, and that local history really connects to a broader question of African American rights after Reconstruction in the American South, which Florida, and again, this was a project I worked on when I was at my college and former institution in Florida. This was a figure who was very active in Republican politics at a time where African Americans were struggling against the loss of citizenship, the loss of voting rights, the loss of space in the public sphere. And he's one of countless individuals who were very active in the American South during this time, who aren't usually sort of like acknowledged in terms of like understanding African American history. And so as the community is sort of like embracing this history, embracing this past, we were talking about it, and it was like, yeah, we could do a one-page comic. A one-page comic can tell his story, and that would make that story very accessible to a range of people. And so when working with the artist, I was just like, this is his life story. Go to town making your decisions about how to depict that, right? Because but these are the facts. We know from the archival work that these are the facts, and you can make some decisions to sort of condense some of these elements to tell a story that will make it clear his contributions. And to do it in one page was important because, you think about, I'm going to give this to kids, I'm going to leave this in churches. It was really a way to sort of tell the story to a large number of people. And that's what this was. This was really a kind of, you can find this sort of archival record about this person, but this really takes that archival record and makes it into like a visual narrative. And it's quite compelling, right? And we're lucky because we had a archival photo of him too. So he was able to work with that photo and sort of like, he sort of looks like this, right? But the Winter Park Advocate is a real newspaper. It was probably the first African American newspaper published in Florida. And Henderson was a community organizer, a huge advocate of African Americans, worked very closely in the Republican Party. And again, at a time in the 1890s where African Americans are facing declining, the nadir, right, as historians of American history refer to, in the 1890s for African Americans as the nadir, the low point, as the rise of anti-Blackness, the rise of Jim Crow, creates like almost an intolerable sort of reversal from the hopefulness of the end of slavery and some of the really innovative efforts made during Reconstruction. So it was a way to sort of tell that story that brought together comics and history, and that was really important to me. And there were a number of people, there were a number of people from the local community that thought like, well, yeah, this format would be really important to tell that local history context. And so this was the first one I got done, and there were other ones that were sort of on the drawing board.
What I love, like as someone with a background in archives and education, I love seeing history comic strips or comic books or graphic novels that include like images that we can find in archives or in other sources, because it is like a way of being able to go back and forth in time. Like I remember reading March, the like John Lewis graphic novel, and he talked about the Martin Luther King comic book. Right. And I found a copy, so I was able to buy a copy, and I just felt like this like sense of pride that I had this archival document that was in the graphic novel too. And I think that like when I worked at the Archives of Ontario, I would get students to create little comic strips based on archival images, and I liked the fact that they could go back and forth. And so this one is really cool too, because it is able to project a different type of story because of the medium, but you're also able to see, again, that familiarity with kind of traditional ways of understanding history. Like we can see it's not based like Future Bear in this new world, but we're allowing elements of different worlds to like intersect with these narratives.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a really compelling
and the artwork is
format.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it turned out, I think, incredibly well, and it does such a great job. And of course, in comics, it's show not tell, right? Like, so the images sort of provide a kind of emotional heft to what we know when we talk about Gus Henderson as an advocate for the community, as a community leader, as such a strong actor. And this is a person who goes on to, publish a newspaper in Orlando, who's a high-ranking Republican elected official who fights, very mightily against sort of like anti-Black policy and tendencies in the South, in Florida in particular. And, it's important to sort of recognize those figures because, this moment, the moment that he's living in, we forget how strongly African Americans are fighting against it, and it corresponds to really important questions about how policy and practice, even the contemporary moment, the moment we're living in, mirror some of the challenges that they're facing, and they did not give up hope, and so we should not give up hope, right? And that's one of the things that. Telling the story of some of these like local heroes and putting them in the context of a broader tableau of like, our sort of communal narrative of progress, which I think at some level it's very difficult to reject when you're a history person. Yeah. The real progress that humanity has made, right? Like, things are better, even though I worry about that. In the context of
you worry about how bad you can imagine it.
Right, yeah, I worry about how bad it can get, but I also know at part of me is like, well, things have gotten better.
Yeah.
And so it's you have to balance them out, right? Like your pessimism and your optimism do have to balance out, and historians I think are probably ideally suited to do both, right? Like to be pessimistic but also to be optimistic, right? Like I can guarantee you, if we travel back in time, and I always tell students, I don't have no desire to travel back in time. Like it's a great story, but like I know the past, so no, I don't want to go back.
But you can get the sports almanac from 2000 and then bet on all of the sports teams like Michael J. Fox style, right? Or Biff style, I don't know.
Yeah. If only we're that simple. But yeah, it's really interesting, and the Advocate. This is the reason I know about Gus Henderson is because of Winter Park Advocate, and Advocate Recover was a digital project where we pieced together the remnants of that Black newspaper. So if you go to www.advocaterecover.org, that's the actual newspaper where we transcribe the fragments of it, and you sort of see, the actual newspaper that he created, right? Oh yeah, you can't do that. Yeah, so this is a transcription project that we also work with on students. Like we're in the archive, and I noticed that we have a lot of scraps that had to have been from the Advocate, and I was like, we should just take some of these scraps, and some of them have been digitized, and just start putting them all in one place, so you get a sense of the world that Gus Henderson was advocating for. Through his work as a newspaper publisher. And so each post is a different sort of little snippet from a scrapbook where the person had cut up newspaper. And you can see Gus Henderson, and some of the politics of the period and things like that. So gives us a sense of the past. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, it does. More things change, more stay the same.
Yeah. When I saw 93 here, I was like, that's not a font from 93. 1893. It's so cool. One of the people I spoke to for Source Saturday, I spoke to a couple people, one that talked about newsletters and another one that talked about newspapers. And we were talking about how newspapers in the past, specifically the 19th century, are so much wordier than we are used to. And to present that to students is pretty overwhelming. And the video was great. He really sold me at least on taking the time to picking out certain things. But I love that this particular website, which to be clear, we did not plan to talk about, but I'm really glad that we are. Kind of pulls some of that out, right? So yeah, I'm glad that this is a 2-for-1 talk.
So yeah, to make the website, I used the WordPress, and we did this in several classes. So putting together the corpus is something I did working in the archive at Rollins College in the special collections, because they have these things called the Winter Park Scrapbook. And the scrapbook has newspaper clippings in it. And when you're looking at the newspaper clippings and you do you do the math in your head, and you go well, I know that the Winter Park Advocate was the only newspaper being published in Winter Park, and that's Gus Henderson newspaper, between 1891 and 1894. And so if this is from 1891, this is from the Winter Park Advocate, because that's the only
right. Math.
Right? Right. I can do that math. So I'm well, there's a lot of these little snippets in here where he's covering different things, right? So I'm and it's totally hidden because it's in an archival source. It's in a scrapbook. But they had made a people's version. So the actual scrapbook is in there, but then they made it one later in the 60s or something.
Right.
Where they sort of photographed everything and made it so people could handle it. So that you could give the students and be okay, here's the original.
Go. Right.
Go in here and transcribe this little bit, right? And so it's clipping. So it's when you go and look, when you're looking at the site, that's why it's each individual post, because you can assign one student this clipping right here. Mm-hmm. I want you to read it, transcribe it, and then put it into the blog, right? And you'll put the metadata in there, blah, blah, blah. So
blah blah blah. I mean, metadata is important.
Right, none of that is important.
I mean, again, like, we did not plan on talking about this, but I did a digital humanities book. Like, we talked about that. I think you tweeted it around, and one of the assignments that I've suggested to people not familiar with digital humanities is basically this: like, find a newspaper and get your students to type it out, because like that's what transcription is here. And it doesn't seem like a lot of work, but like, when I was supervising students, I found that the students were like learning more about like they did not articulate it this way, but like the intersection between grammar and the time period too. Like, they were looking at text in different ways, and then they could make a word cloud from it, and it was just kind of a cool thing that you think is just like labor, but it became an interesting assignment, and so it's extra cool. You're proving my point in your own assignment that like you did far before I like even suggested this. So I'll like tag this with that assignment too.
Yeah, well, because it's a transcription, I want to correct that. I'm like, no, do not correct anything in this. You were trying to transcribe it exactly like it looked. If you can't do that, then just put like an XX in there.
Right. They just want to like put in Beyonce Knowles right here.
Right, yeah. Like, no, you're transcribing. Transcribing means that you're not changing things. This is, this says, it's not your job to grammar edit the past.
You're not time traveling.
You're not time traveling. And so one of the things about this is that because we had, they had also incredibly scanned the original for a digital version, but the OCR on it was so bad that it was very difficult, almost impossible to search it. So you couldn't find it.
Right.
So even though it was digitized, and like, and this is also a revelation for students, because they always think like when something's done digitally, it must be perfect. I'm like, that's not true.
Yeah.
Like, that's not what
it's not even close to being true.
like you see it, yeah, it might seem perfect, but let me tell you, like when it getting it there,
But and also things like, and this was something that became a really central part of our project too, is like the search terms we would use now are not necessarily the vocabulary people would have used. So like, sure, you can type in a word and it might be there, but not the way you mean it. Like, even if the scan is really clean. So it's like, it really highlights just using your brain. I say to my students, use your human brain. Right.
Yeah. So this is a great effort on the part of the students, because like, just having that conversation about don't correct, and then like metadata, right? Because like, how are you describing this?
Yeah.
And in this case, since it's not a Dublin core based system, which I've done things with Omeka, and then it becomes like we have to talk about Dublin core. Here it's just like you need keywords that will differentiate each individual entry. And there's a logic to that, right? So, one logic is time, date, place, people. And then another logic is a sort of like understanding of the sort of thematic elements associated with like a particular story, right? And so because you have a number of different students working, and we have other projects, so they can link to things in the actual body of the text. Like I said, well, if you know for a fact that Gus Henderson, for instance, we did a database, we did like an encyclopedia, online encyclopedia of Winter Park residents, and so there's an entry on Gus Henderson in there. So like, oh yeah, you can link to that because we know who Gus Henderson is. Right. And we know who Capon is, right? Because that's another founding person. And so it becomes like a kind of intertextual reality created between other online encyclopedic informational sources that the institution has created, and supporting between this one, which is, it's a baseline, a WordPress site, that we're trying to customize to be as functional as possible, and allowing people to find information about sort of like themes that matter.
Well, and to me, like one of the things that came up when we did the digital humanities book, and I'm hearing similar things like that can draw on that, is how students then learn like it's just people behind ascribing those words to it. You know, like there isn't some sort of like big Dublin core God that's like, this is the one and only word we can ascribe to these things. Like how it's people and how those people are looking at particular things that they're seeing because of their own positions.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, sorry.
No, I was just agreeing with you. Yeah. I mean, like we had a lot of discussions about knowledge. Over the years, because I do a lot of projects with, sort of critical making in the classroom, and it's historical. And so over the years, I've talked a lot about like the difference between like good information and bad information, but also the nature of knowledge that is created by individuals, because it's people that put it into the system. It doesn't just like hop up off the page and get in there. Someone's got to input it, right? And so whatever decision you make becomes the institutional record.
Yeah.
Right. So like, you should pause and think about what you're about to say and do, and what systems and what ontologies around systems sort of predict, right? Like when you're looking with Dublin core, the nature of the categories are kind of prescribed. So like a lot of things involving comics are comic strips, etc. Right? Like it's because that's like a category.
Yeah.
And if you want to be more precise, you have to think about adding other categories under Dublin core that are going to get at some of the possibility of what's happening in that subject matter. Otherwise, it would become lost for people who might be looking for it, right? And we talk a lot about that in projects that I do here.
This great article that I'll direct people to if they're interested in thinking more about this is an article. Okay, I might not be thinking of the correct name because, again, we did not plan to talk about this. But it was like J.R. Roston, and they wrote an article about a sexuality archive at a university, and that it was a large collection of photographs of people that we would identify as transgender now, but like people in the photographs may not have identified themselves as transgender because that was not a common term 50, 60, 70 years ago. And so the article was like, do we put these terms on people that may not have associated with them? And also your transgender identity doesn't actually have to do with your sexuality. So like, should these photographs be in a sex archive? And like, it was just a really interesting way of like thinking about our own positions in relationship to this knowledge. And like you said, this institutional record, because once it's in there, you think it's in there. And I did this paper for a women's studies conference about a photograph that was at the Archives of Ontario. And it was a group of women hockey players. It was like a professional photograph in 19th century professional studio portrait of these hockey players. And the title was Girls Hockey Team. And I remember saying to someone like, who's calling these women girls? Because like, first, they do not look like they suffer fools gladly. These look like very serious athletes. And like, they're not girls, like they're women. They look like they're in their 30s. And they're like, oh, I don't know. Like it could have been an archivist like 30 years ago. And so I just changed the name. And we put the photograph in the promotional material. I changed it to Women's Hockey Team because I was like, these are not set in stone, right? Like knowledge changes. Yeah. Okay. We've completely got off topic in like a really amazing way. I promised you I would be like quick on time, and like, I'll just say this is your fault for being so interested in bringing a new thing to this conversation. You're welcome. And so my last question is like, how does the nature of the medium of graphic narratives, comic books, how does that challenge how we normally teach and learn something like history?
I think comic books have a tremendous potential to aid in lots of different tools in terms of interpretation when it comes to comics. Be it like making comics, like I make zines in my class, and that's an opportunity for students to piece together narratives based on their understanding of a subject. So like I often advocate for a collage approach to the comic as opposed to like stressing people about can they draw.
Right. Yeah.
But I also, think about comics as an archive, right? They're a living archive of different places, different people, different experiences, and you can integrate comics into any class for sure. There's no subject matter that a comic can't provide differing levels of engagement. If it's a class on history, you want to make it very social, there are great autobiographical comics, great biographical comics that will help you tell stories related to like First Nations peoples, related to African American experience, related to women's history. If it's a political, comic, there's an opportunity there to think about a variety of things created for the popular culture that reflect a kind of shift in politics, that reflect an evolution in thinking. And piecing those things together in the context of a class can be really useful, in part because they're accessible, because the characters are intended for a kind of mass audience. And so I just always think about comics as having the potential to be a really great tool in a classroom that you can sort of meld to whatever task that you're setting out for yourselves. And, I know we always think about learning outcomes and learning goals. And whatever those are, I think comics can help you sort of get there.
Yeah, I love that, because it's not so often we can think of things like comics as just like fun things that we can do once the like real learning is over, or like the serious stuff is done. And like this has been so great for a lot of reasons, but one, to like highlight that we can do that serious stuff through this medium. So thank you. This was great. Another wonderful conversation, Julian. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. Yeah, like you remind me I need to get back to Feature Bear. I got to get that on my schedule.
Do you want me to give you more things to work on? Like, because I can. I can give you my to-do list. Do you want that?
Oh, no. I know. My own to-do list is horrible. So.
Okay. Yeah, this has been wonderful, and I actually am really glad that we wound up coming back, not back, but like we circled to digital humanities and archives, because like something that you talked about last time about how we can like imagine differently because of this digital world, and so it's been just really great to be able to touch on all that stuff today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
So get back to your to-do list. Give us the next issue. So we'll talk later.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
That was great.
That's right.
I was like, oh my gosh, we're in this like totally new area.
Yeah, like I was expecting you to like pull up Advocate. I was like, oh, okay, I guess we can talk about it.
But you said if you type in www, and I was like, oh, I guess I'm typing it in. I was like, was that a direction? Okay, I can follow directions.
I was thinking more like if someone's watching this and they're curious, they would type in www.
Yeah, but like there was a line there that I'm like, it could just be me. Let's do that.
Right, yeah.